So while they're getting settled, I'm going to do some disclaimers up front. I'm a firm believer in the fact that just because a sponsor says you can ask for up to $3 million, you should only ask for $3 million if it goes with the work. So that's always my caveat. Just because we can ask for an amount doesn't mean we go to that amount. It has to be based on the work that's going to be done. So from my perspective, there are always two main goals for a budget. One is to make it strategic and the other is to make it realistic, because a reviewer is going to look at what you're asking for based on the work. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later. And you really want a budget at the proposal or the pre-award stage for post-award management and success. So that means really on the front end, having time to consider all the resources you're going to need, that's personnel and anything else you're going to need to support that work. That includes team members too, consultants, subawardees, whatever you're going to need, because if you get it right on the front end, or as right as you can, realizing there are always going to be changes, it is much easier to manage on the back end. So you really have to know the pieces and know the restrictions. So there can be a host of potential restrictions. They can vary by sponsor. We also have sometimes some institutional restrictions, such as during COVID, no one was traveling. Some of those things fluctuate. Some are really done on the front end. So the two things to look at are the solicitation, because there can be things that are specific to that particular program. And the sponsor guidelines may be overall looking at what's required and what's allowable or unallowable. So one of the big things would be PI or co-PI salaries, really any salaries on the grant and or fringe benefits. One time I actually had an application when I was in the research office where they would not cover fringe benefits. In that case, because we're obviously asking for salaries, those fringe benefits are going to have to be covered by the department out of IDCR or some other funds. I have only seen that once. Equipment, we don't see this often in the College of Education. Equipment is defined as anything over $5,000 in value. So it's not a laptop, it's not a printer. We're typically going to see this in biology, chemistry, our engineering counterparts, maybe in computer science. Travel, domestic or international. Sometimes international travel is prohibited. So someone would love to go to a grant that's in Australia, to go to a conference there to present for dissemination.
931-209-8476.
International travel. So you
Katrina
have to look at that.
Mangrum. Okay.
Sometimes
I'll give it a miss.
subawardees are restricted on a grant. We can't include them. We can't have a pass down to someone. That's obviously a consideration when you're looking at a team. And then indirect costs are sometimes restricted. In fact, they're often, we have restrictions about rates. So I'm going to talk through major line items that we're usually see in a grant budget. Obviously personnel, that's effort, and also fringe benefits. Equipment, again, we don't see it a lot. Travel, supplies, participant support, subawards, other direct costs, and then indirect costs. And we'll go through these each a little bit. So personnel and benefits. The effort that someone is asking for should align with the work that's going to be done. And I can't stress that enough, because again, a reviewer is going to look at that. Do you really need 2 months in the summer for what we're saying that person's going to do? So that's a really important consideration. Do you have to hire anyone? GAs is probably what we see most often on our proposal applications, but we also see postdocs. Sometimes we have undergraduate student workers. We often have temp employees, so you really have to think about, if I get funded, who am I going to need to hire and how long might that hiring take? For example, it could take you 6 months to find the right postdoc, but we have to budget for them fully in the year that you want to hire them. So you can't say, oh, in year one, it's going to take me 6 months. I'm only going to ask for half the salary. You have to ask for the entire salary because that's what HR is going to look for when we go to do that hiring paperwork. We always escalate salaries at 3% per year. That's been about our average. As you know, some years we get it, some years we don't. But that's a pretty good bellwether for us. For faculty, we also need to account for tenure because that's a bigger bump than the 3% typically. So oftentimes, for example, on a 5-year grant, if I'm anticipating a faculty member may get to that tenure line in year 2, I'm going to do their budget accordingly. So I'm going to say, this is where they are now. This is where they might be projected to be. So we make sure to ask that for that projection so we're not short. Fringe benefits, again, have to be included for everybody at the university set rates. Those are in our rate agreement. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. Again, unless they're prohibited by the funder. I've only seen that once. There are sometimes funding restrictions for salary. NIH has a salary cap. HRSA has a cap of what we can ask for based on someone's salary. We have very few in the College of Education that hit those thresholds, but sometimes a sponsor will cap what we can ask for. So then we have to look at that. When we have to use match or cost share, for example, on some of our grants, we have a required match, 8%, 20%, 11%, 10%. We typically use a faculty member's academic year salary and associated fringe benefits and indirect costs to meet that match. We don't want to give hard cash. We're going to use time that someone would already be paid for anyway, and that's allocated to the grant. Equipment, again, we don't see it a lot here. It's anything over 5,000. One thing I'll see sometimes is someone will want to buy a computer. It's $1,500. And if they go ahead and try and draft that budget for me, they put it in the equipment line. Well, that is impacted on our indirect cost allocation. That's a supply for us. If we ever had anyone say in STEM, we wanted to outfit a lab on an NSF grant and we were going to buy a piece of equipment that was $5,000. We always want to include a quote for that if we can. So the funder sees the homework's been done on the front end. You really know what it's going to cost to do that. So travel, it has to be based, excuse the typo, I ended it and missed that. Based on reasonable costs for airfare, ground transportation, lodging, per diem, conference, using the government's CONUS rates. So for example, if you're going to Nashville, it's not going to be $1,000 for a plane ticket, right? It's always good on travel. So if you're going to disseminate a conference, it's really hard to know maybe where a conference is going to be in any given year. So you kind of have to look back. Maybe it's someplace consistently, maybe it's not. What would those potential costs be? So airfare, your lodging, all those kinds of things. Sometimes we have seen, I recently had a Department of Ed where we had to do a chart for the travel by year with all the costs broken out. So you've really got to think it's 2 night stay, it's 3 night stay. So we get those costs as accurately as we can on the front end. If there's going to be travel, we have to identify if it's domestic or international. Again, international, we're looking at allowability. Lee just had one where they did a great job detailing the potential costs based on where those conferences have been before. So that's really, really important. Sponsors, we see this most often in NSF. They may have a PI meeting and a 5-year grant. It could be years 1, 3, and 5. It could just be the first year. So again, we want to make sure we capture those costs based on obviously NSF if it's in DC. And then to consider costs for team meetings, for dissemination, and again, for dissemination, naming the conferences you're going to go. That doesn't just say potentially it's here, but it's this conference really aligns with the work that's being done. This would be a good place for us to go and share what we've learned based on our research. Yeah, we're good. Yep. Thank you. So supplies. We have consumables, and this supplies can be a range of things, right? I always encourage a faculty member, if they have room in the budget, to include a computer and or printer in the grant in year 1. If you're going to have a GA working and they're going to be doing a lot of work with data collection or analysis or anything, it's a great way for us to upgrade our infrastructure, and it's allowable on a grant. Now, you have to make sure that GA or whoever's using it is not also on Facebook or anything else, right? It's for the grant. But especially if they're going to be having to go out into the community for any kind of data collection, for surveys or interviews, that's certainly an allowable cost on a grant. If you had a 5-year grant and you're going to have a lot of data collection, a lot of analysis, you might even want to, in year 4, include a computer again, because computers change, right? Things get updated, there's wear, all those things. Again, it's an allowable cost if you justify it. Sometimes data management devices, recording devices, if you're going to be doing a lot of focus groups, and then classroom resources for teachers. If you're going to go into a classroom, someone's going into a classroom and doing work with students, it's certainly appropriate to buy a STEM kit, to buy a kit related to social emotional learning that's going to be done with the students. You can leave that with the teacher when you're done. It's a way to thank the teacher for their participation in the work beyond anything else you may do. And we shouldn't expect that a school or a teacher is going to provide resources for our research to be done. So it's certainly an allowable cost. So participant support is probably one of the trickiest things to figure out. This is not human subjects incentives. We most often see it on a training or a conference, grant, or scholarships like Steve has, where we're providing, it can be tuition and a stipend, it could be books for those who are participating. So it could be tuition, it could be meals for a conference. Sometimes it is travel costs. And this is not included in our indirect cost calculation. None of the participant support costs are. So that's one of the things we really look at. And that's something I can help you navigate. So subawards versus consultants. Can't stretch this enough, how important it is to get this right on the front end, because it makes a difference in the budget. It makes a difference in our agreement. It makes a difference, frankly, in what we have to have for the proposal. So the key word is their scientific involvement. So if in a subaward, what we're saying is, let's use the example of Emory University. You have someone there you want to collaborate with. They bring an expertise to the project that's really needed. They're going to be doing a big portion of the work. They have specific responsibilities they're going to have. They have programmatic decision-making. They're going to contribute to the scholarly or scientific conduct of the work. They can use some judgment, and they have discretionary judgment in how the work may progress based on how things move along. They're going to be a co-author on publications. They're going to help with dissemination. Not so much for us on the animal studies, but if human subjects are involved, it's probably a subaward on their side. And in the indirect cost calculation, no matter how much they have over the years, we're only going to charge our indirects on the first 25,000. Another thing about subawards, knowing early when we're doing a proposal, if we have a subaward, we really have to factor in our deadlines for the proposal. There are some institutions that if their documents aren't routed and approved 10 days before a submission, a deadline, it doesn't go. Now, we're a lot more flexible at the University of Memphis. We ask for 5, it's not written in stone, but some institutions will say, sorry, you didn't have it to us in time, you're done. If we have a deadline of April 1st, we really need all the subaward documents, especially the budget, 2 weeks before our deadline. So if the deadline with the sponsor is April 1st, we have to route ideally a week before suddenly, and you need their documents 2 weeks before. That's a big impact, right? And that's something, if you have a subawardee, I would say, connect me as soon as possible with my counterpart at that institution. That way we can work on those documents. So faculty focuses on the scientific. Now, certainly there may be some negotiation with their budget, but that's something that we can easily handle. A consultant is really kind of like an expert advisor. It's a routine service. You know, if we were in engineering, we would say, Smith Consulting is going to provide a bunch of widgets. They're a consultant, right? Or they're going to say, are we, you know, making the widgets in a way that's correct? Their involvement is really on a limited basis. They're not really involved with publishing or intellectual party. So I'm going to say a third-party evaluator on a really limited role. Not like we often see with our friends with CREP, where it's robust, and a lot of times they fall into that subaward category based on the breadth of work they're doing. So it's really a case-by-case basis on evaluating that subaward versus the consultant. Has a huge impact on how things move along, especially because if it's a federal application, we're going to have a host of documents for that subawardee organization to include in our application. So other direct costs, and there can be a host of things for this. Tuition for our GAs. If you have a GA, unless it's prohibited, we have to include tuition for a GA on the grants. That's university policy. Now, we don't have to include for the summer. So I usually budget at 9 hours. Even though the last year we did not have much of an increase, I always put my preferences to put 5%, usually at least 4 in the budget, because that's what we have seen in the past when it comes to tuition increases. We have some units where 6 hours for a GA and their program might be normal. So then we're going to budget at the 6. Publications, every sponsor wants to see dissemination. And if there are costs associated with that publication, it's certainly appropriate to include them in a budget. Being able to identify what those journals are, online resources, because again, most reviewers are going to be familiar with where it might be appropriate for you to publish. Human subjects payments, you have someone participating in a focus group. It's certainly appropriate to compensate them for their time. Mostly, we try and do this in the form of gift cards because it's frankly the easiest thing to do and to track versus a check to somebody, right? Teacher incentives, again, you're in a classroom, they're in a focus group. It may be that you provide a kit for their room. That can be an incentive, as well as gift cards that they could use to purchase stuff for their rooms. An advisory board. We typically see this on NSF grants where they might have an advisory board, usually 3 to 5 people. it's appropriate to compensate them for the work on a yearly basis. Again, being reasonable for the time we think they're going to need to be involved. Printing, we only see printing when we have a high volume. It's not the normal printing associated with the work that's covered by our indirect cost recovery. But if you, probably not as much now as in the past, we're going to survey 500 people and you really wanted a paper copy, including those printing costs would be appropriate, right? A lot of times now that's done online, so we don't see that maybe as much anymore. But printing could also apply to recruitment brochures. Fees for processing samples, again, we don't see that a lot. Animal care costs. So all those other costs needed to support the work. And then indirect costs. So the university has an indirect cost rate. Our agreement is with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. It's done every year. And what this is based on is they come in and evaluate based on documentation we provide. It costs the university X percentage to do research. That's keeping the lights on. It's paying for people like in our grants and counting or sponsored research or our animal care folks or people like me if they're, not in a department. What's the cost of our doing research or service work? And so that's set again by the feds. We have to use the rates, and there are several rates. There's a research rate, which is the highest. It's 43.5. I've seen institutions where their rates up about 80%, right? Depending on, and a lab space certainly impacts that. We have a service rate, a public service rate. So it varies based on the kind of work that's going to be done. We have to use those rates unless the sponsor won't allow it or they have a set rate. For example, in the College of Ed, we see a lot of Spencer grants. Spencer on the small grant doesn't allow indirects. On a large grant, it's 20%, but it doesn't include any subaward funds, not 25%, any. So whenever we can, we want to capture those indirects that the sponsor lets us do. We don't want to lower them. So where can you be flexible? Sometimes you have to. The budget's tight based on the personnel you need or the resources that are needed. So you can adjust effort and or personnel across years. For example, maybe you really need a postdoc at the end because there's so much work that's going to be done and you need that level of expertise. It's a 5-year grant. Maybe you don't need them in years 1 and 2. So we put them in the budget at years 3 through 5. Or maybe you need more help on the front end. We had an NSF grant where the STEM ambassadors from engineering were involved. They were needed not in year 1 in ramp up. They were needed in years 2 and 3 to go into the schools, but they're not needed in years 4 and 5. So it's a place you can be flexible. Maybe with staff. More effort is needed in 1 year versus another, more on the front end, less on the back end, or vice versa. So that's a good place to really consider and flex. For a faculty member, maybe when they're really in the throes, they need a course buyout in a certain year or years. So that's something to look at. Budget for travel after year 1, unless you have a required meeting. Rarely will there be any dissemination in year 1. So saying I'm going to disseminate in year 1 may make someone go, really? You're going to move along that fast? Dissemination's usually going to be in your latter years, or it's going to build maybe in 1 year. The first year you can only have the PI go to disseminate, but maybe in the later years you have more team members going because they've been involved with the work. So that's a place things can ebb and flow. Again, including publication costs after year 1, probably not going to publish in that first year, is a place that you can be flexible. So what's cost share? I touched on this briefly. Cost share, match, we sometimes use those interchangeably. So it's a university's contribution to the project, usually required. We don't want to cost share unless we have to. And it's, again, usually involving salary, associated fringe benefits, and or indirects. And examples can be NSF academic year. NSF says they don't want to cover more than 2 months, is what they say, of funded effort on a grant. Typically, we're funding summertime when people aren't on contract. So if we're not requesting academic year effort, which I have, we put some effort because we know the PI is going to have to be working or other members of the team during that time. We usually just do it for the PI. Or required match. Steve on his grant, again, has a required match. Dr. Shiro Geist on her grant has a required match. Our goal is always to get as close as we can to that required match without going over it. So the budget justification, I will typically provide examples for that. They can really vary by sponsor. Some are pretty minimal. Some are very involved. Some can be done for the life of a project as one. Some have to be broken out by years. So we really have to look at what the sponsor requires. We should always write the justification based on how the sponsor orders their budget in their application. It just makes it easier for a reviewer or for their program staff to go down in the same order that their budget document is in. Again, sometimes sponsors require by year and not just for overall. So looking at that individual solicitation is what usually guides how that needs to be done. So post-award management. Oftentimes we're submitting a grant and it's a year before we get a funding decision or 9 months. And a lot can happen in that time. Our fringe benefit rates may change. You may have a team member change. Someone leaves the university, or you need to add someone, or they've gotten a promotion. So whenever we get an award, the dates frankly could change. We've seen that. We're going to take the budget done at the time of proposal and adjust it based on the award. If it's a multi-year award and they're only giving the first year of funding, that's all we're going to worry about at that time. We're not going to worry about years 2 through 5 because a lot can change in years 2 through 5. So we're going to do the award budget as we get it in that case by year based on salaries, fringe, whatever happens to be involved. You really need to manage throughout the project and partner with the business officer. We have started at the time of award having meetings with our PIs, Tracy and myself, and the business officer. So the business officers in each department really understand, have a high-level snapshot of what's going to be involved with that project. They know right away they're going to have to look at helping to hire a GA. They know right away they're going to have to maybe help purchase this. So it gets them started on the right foot. Rebudgeting. Sometimes for rebudget, we don't need to ask the sponsor. There are some sponsors we have to have prior approval no matter how much it is. Some sponsors are only prior approval for certain categories or within a certain percentage. So if funded, and we need to look at that, that's one thing we're going to have a conversation about. Do we need to go to the sponsor, or is it something we can simply revise the budget and send it over to grants accounting and upload it to the CAIUS record? No cost extensions. Things get started later than you think, or there are delays. Certainly, we saw this at the start of COVID, where projects didn't get going like we thought. No cost extensions have to be approved by the sponsor, and that's not obviously additional money. It's just additional time. Those have to be approved by the sponsor. Sometimes we need an amendment to the agreement. Sometimes an email suffices. Sponsored programs just rolled out a new form for us to use for this. A no-cost extension ideally is requested at least 60 days before an end date. 30 is okay. I confess there are times we've asked for it after a grant's expired and we've gotten it. But again, sooner is better. So PIs, grants folks, me trying to do a better job of saying, hey, are you going to be done on this end date? Or do we need to start a no cost extension request? Really important. So I'm going to tell a story after I say this. Here's my watchword. It's always easier to ask for money on the front end and to get the budget right on the front end than it is to make changes on the backside. It's just a whole lot easier to do it at that point. So starting the budget early when you're starting to work on the project summary or specific aims or tasks is really important. I was working with someone recently and we had several iterations and then they forgot, oh, we need to compensate the teachers. So then we had to look at some other line items because we had somehow missed that in the conversation. So you really need to think about all the pieces that again go into a budget. So before questions, here's my watchword. It's one of the best examples I have for budgeting. So Gary Bolin, who's in biomedical engineering, was on an NIH review panel. And this man next to him pulled out the budget and pulled out the specific aims, which is a one-page document, project summary. Here's what I'm going to do for the project. And the guy looked at it and he read through it and then he went like this and said, nope. And so Gary asked him, he goes, what do you mean? And he said, he has overpromised in his specific aims for what the budget will support. So one of two things is going to happen. He's going to get in the hole on the budget and his budget officer is going to nag him because he's overexpended, or he's going to be tempted to cut corners on his scope because he knows he's going in the hole on his budget. So Gary said that was a really good lesson for me to learn. If someone looks at it from a very high level and pulls out my budget and that one-page summary, do those things give him, is there enough alignment that someone's going to keep reading in my application? Or have I tanked myself because my budget's not reasonable for the work I'm going to do? So that's one of my favorite budget stories. I think it's a really good watchword. Funders are looking for, again, if you don't need to ask for the 2 million, that means maybe they can fund more projects. So being reasonable, I think, is really, really important. So any questions? Yep.
I have one question that might be relevant to college ed stuff. So it's a question that can be relevant to anybody really, but especially in the college ed. So you were saying, there's the discussion about academic year pay and who gets paid.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about the difference between research faculty who are expected to be doing research, tenure track faculty who are expected to do research, and clinical faculty who may be on a grant proposal, but have no research time built in their responsibilities?
Right. So it's kind of challenging with our clinical or our 12-month folks. And I'm going to say prep's kind of our exception to that, but we have clinical faculty on grants. We are recovering the percentage of their salary that's devoted to that, but they've got to look at all their responsibilities and probably have a conversation, frankly, with their chair. Do I have this time to devote to research based on other responsibilities they have? So those are good conversations to have, I think. And The other thing is to consider for anybody looking at what's funded, what they're putting in, and the potential impact, one on them and two on the department, right? Because there's only so much time in a day. For example, in the summer, if you're a 9-month faculty, can have up to 90% funding. No one's ever going to be funded at 100% of what their summer pay could be. 90 is the rule, but you also have to consider any teaching responsibilities. So we have to look at that span. A course buyout, we budget at 13%. So 13% buys out one course in a semester, obviously not the whole year. So you have to look at that. Those course buyouts, when we have them, those funds go to hiring an adjunct to cover the course. Then it's not a departmental cost. It's actually a cost that's covered by that grant funding. So anyone who gets really high on their funded effort and or 12-month really should be having a discussion with their chair, potential impact for others. And we certainly have some faculty across campus. They are just research faculty. That's their job, you know. They are supported by grants. They're supposed, I mean, that's what they do. Did that answer the question?
Yeah.
Anything else? The biggest thing I can say is to start early. I always say this, it's true on a budget like it's true on an application. I would rather start really early and maybe get to the end and it not be a go than to start late. The other thing I will say is anytime we're giving anyone a budget, there are instances where if we're a subawardee to another organization, we might say, here's our preliminary budget that has not been approved, reviewed and approved by our Office of Sponsored Programs so they can see if it fits or if we have to negotiate, right? But anything where we're submitting a budget where the funds come to the university, that ideally is approved by the Office of Sponsored Programs before that submission or budget goes in. Now, there are times that hasn't happened, not just here, across campus, I will tell you. But again, starting soon, getting that approval. Sometimes we ask for clarification on indirect cost rates. Is this really other sponsored research or is it research? You know, there's about a 7 percentage point difference on the indirect cost rate. And sometimes there can be gray areas. So again, start early, ask questions. That's what we're here for.
How many hours? The base number of hours about number. What's the base number of hours?
1920 for the year is the base. And that would be a 12 months. So but even summer faculty, you know, when we have summer effort, we're going to look at that. So for example, in the summer, 1 month is about 33% effort. You know, 17% is about, you know, half a month. So you look at the time that's needed. And, you know, sometimes those calculations we got to manipulate and look at. You know, we have some of our state budgets where we actually have to put the percentage of time, and I've gone down to 3 decimal points on the percentage of effort to get the dollar amount that we have in our budget, which we're not usually not going to look at 4.196%, right? But in the state budgets, that's what we have to do. So a lot of times there's some manipulation in the documents we have to turn in with our proposals. All right, well, thank you all. If you have questions, let me know. Always glad to help.